They left home twice that night. The first time, neighbors watched them pull into the driveway just as the sun was setting. An ordinary evening in Wilber, Nebraska, July 28, 1973. The kind of summer night where nothing dramatic happens. The second time they turned north, then east, into the warm darkness. They never came back. No body was ever found, no car, no witness who saw them after that turn. Just a week of newspapers piling up on the porch, bottles of milk going sour in the heat, and a house with the front door left unlocked. 2 weeks before they vanished, Walter bought a Kansas road map. He told his son they weren't traveling anymore. One of those statements was a lie. This is the story of two people who disappeared so quietly the world didn't notice for 7 days. And when it finally did, the only theory anyone could offer was the one nobody wanted to believe. If you're watching from a small town where everyone knows your name, drop a comment below and tell us where you're from. And if you believe some mysteries are designed to stay quiet, hit that subscribe button, because this one never stopped whispering. Part 1. The evening of July 28, 1973, was warm and still in Wilber, Nebraska. Population just under 1,400. The kind of place where people left their doors unlocked and knew their neighbors by first name. A farming town settled by Czech immigrants in the 1800s, proud of its heritage, its annual Czech festival, its tight-knit community. That night, around 8:30 p.m., several neighbors saw the same thing. A beige 1958 Chevrolet 210 pulled into the driveway of a modest single-story house on the east side of town. An older couple got out. The man moved slowly but steadily. The woman needed help. They went inside. Less than 10 minutes later, the car pulled out again, north on the residential street, then a right turn, east, onto the first crossroad. No one thought much of it. The couple often took evening drives. Short trips around town, out to the countryside, nothing unusual. No one waved, no one called out. It was just another summer evening. That was the last time anyone saw Walter and Edith Krupka. Walter Krupka was 72 years old in 1973. Born in what was then Bohemia, he'd immigrated to the United States at 17 with nothing but a strong back and a willingness to work. He became a mason, a carpenter, a farmer. He built homes. He built a life. Edith was 70, a Nebraska native, born and raised in the flatlands. She met Walter in the 1920s, and they married in 1921. 52 years together by the summer of 1973. They'd moved to Wilber in 1957. It made sense. So many Czech families lived there. The language, the food, the traditions. On Sundays after Mass at St. Wenceslaus, you could hear as much Czech as English on the church steps. Edith wasn't Czech by blood, but she'd learned the language from Walter, picked up the recipes, attended the festivals. She fit in. Wilber took pride in being the Czech capital of Nebraska. Every summer, the town held its Czech Days festival. Polka bands, kolaches, women in traditional Croix dresses, men dancing the beseda in the street. Walter and Edith never missed it. They'd sit on folding chairs in front of the bakery, watching the parade, Walter tapping his foot to the music while Edith clapped along. The last festival they attended was in June 1973. People who saw them there said they seemed quieter than usual. Edith looked tired. Walter kept checking on her, bringing her water, making sure she was comfortable in the shade. No one thought it was unusual. She was 70. Of course she got tired. Walter worked odd jobs well into his 60s, even after he officially retired. Fixing things. Building things. He couldn't sit still. He'd repaired half the porches in Wilber, patched roofs, built garden sheds for neighbors who couldn't afford a contractor. He never charged much. Sometimes he'd accept payment in produce from someone's garden or a home-cooked meal. People liked Walter. He was quiet but reliable. If he said he'd be there Tuesday morning, he'd be there Tuesday morning. If he said it would cost $50, it cost $50. Edith kept a garden, played bingo on weekends at the community hall, and attended church every Sunday without fail. She baked kolaches for church fundraisers, volunteered at the community center, and helped organize the annual rummage sale every spring. They were fixtures in Wilber, the kind of people everyone knew but no one thought much about. To anyone who knew them, they seemed like a solid, dependable couple. Quiet, private, not the type to cause trouble or draw attention, but underneath that calm exterior, life had not been kind. In 1959, Edith's son from her first marriage died. Thomas. He'd been 28. A car accident outside of Lincoln. The funeral was small. The details were rarely spoken about, even within the family. Grief was private in those days. You buried your dead, you cried behind closed doors, and you moved forward. Then, in 1960, their daughter, Walter, and Edith's only daughter together, died of polio. Her name was Anna. She was 11 years old. It happened in August. She'd complained of a headache, then a stiff neck. By the time they got her to the hospital in Lincoln, the paralysis had already started. She died 3 days later. Walter didn't speak for a week after the funeral. He went to work every day, came home, sat in his chair, and stared at the wall. Edith cried herself to sleep every night for months. They never talked about Anna after that, not to friends, not to neighbors, not even really to each other. Her room stayed exactly as she'd left it for 2 years before Edith finally packed everything away. That left only one child. Their son, Dennis, who was in his 40s by 1973, married to a woman named Patricia. They lived nearby, and Patricia helped out often, especially as Edith's health began to decline. Because by 1973, Edith was struggling. Diabetes, high blood pressure, chronic pain in her joints. Some days she could barely get out of bed. She moved slowly, carefully, as though her body was a fragile thing that might break. Her doctor in Crete had told them in May that her condition was worsening. Her kidneys weren't functioning properly. The medication helped, but it wasn't enough. She needed regular monitoring. Eventually, he said gently, she might need more intensive care than Walter could provide at home. Walter had nodded, said nothing, drove them home in silence. He took care of her, cooking, cleaning, helping her dress, helping her to the bathroom, helping her into bed at night. He never complained, never asked for help, but people noticed the weight on him, the way his shoulders seemed heavier, the way he stopped joking around at the hardware store, the way his hands shook slightly when he counted out change. Patricia came by 2 or 3 times a week. She'd help with the laundry, tidy up the kitchen, sit with Edith while Walter ran errands. She worried about them both. "He's wearing himself out," she told Dennis more than once. "He won't say it, but I can see it." Dennis suggested hiring someone to help, or looking into a nursing facility just for a little while, just to give his father a break. Walter refused. "I'm not putting her in one of those places," he said, firmly, final. It wasn't up for discussion. In early July 1973, something shifted. Walter told Dennis he didn't think he'd be traveling anymore, not even the short trips they used to take down to Kansas to visit distant relatives or over to Iowa for a cousin's birthday. "We're staying close to home now," he said. It made sense. Edith's health, Walter's age. Why would they go anywhere? But then, on July 14th, Walter walked into Jean's service station on the south edge of town and bought a road map, Kansas, Nebraska. The attendant, Jean Matson, remembered it clearly. Walter asked for that specific map. Not just Nebraska, Kansas, Nebraska. "Planning a trip, Walt?" Jean asked. Walter nodded, paid in cash, left without another word. Jean thought it was odd. Everyone knew Walter and Edith weren't going anywhere, but he didn't think much of it. People bought maps for all kinds of reasons. What strange is this? Why tell your son you're done traveling, then buy a road map 2 weeks later? Unless you don't want him to know where you're going. On the afternoon of July 28th, something else happened. Around 2 p.m., Walter's neighbor across the street, Leonard Beans, was mowing his lawn when he saw Walter loading the trunk of the Chevrolet. 2 suitcases, both large, old leather, the kind with metal clasps, and a cardboard box, medium-sized, sealed with tape. Leonard waved, called out over the sound of the mower. "Going somewhere, Walt?" Walter looked up, paused for just a moment. "Just cleaning out the garage," he said. Then he closed the trunk and went back inside. Leonard didn't think about it again, not until weeks later, when Patricia mentioned something that didn't make sense. Nothing was missing from the garage. That evening, around 8:30, neighbors saw the Krupkas come home. It was starting to get dark, that soft in-between light of late summer. Walter helped Edith out of the car. Slowly, she leaned on him. They went inside. A few minutes later, maybe 5, maybe 10, the car backed out of the driveway again. North, then east, gone. No one thought to check on them. Why would they? The Krupkas kept to themselves, but they were fine. Always fine. It was Patricia who noticed. She'd been out of town the previous week, visiting her sister in Omaha. She usually stopped by the Krupkas' house on Saturdays, but she'd missed the last one. On August 4th, a Saturday, she drove over around 10 a.m. The first thing she saw was the newspapers, 7 of them, stacked neatly on the porch, still in their plastic sleeves, untouched. Then she saw the milk bottles, 4 of them, sitting in the heat, curdled and sour. Her stomach dropped. She knocked. No answer. She tried the door. It opened, unlocked. Inside, everything looked normal. The furniture was in place. The dishes were clean. The beds were made. But there were small things, wrong things. Edith's black purse, the one she always carried, was gone. 2 bottles of prescription medication sat on the kitchen counter. Edith's. She took them every day. She wouldn't have left them behind. The kitchen calendar hung on the wall, still turned to July. The last notation was on the 28th, in Edith's handwriting. Church, 4 p.m., and the car was missing. Patricia called Dennis. Dennis called the police. The Wilber Police Department was small, 3 full-time officers and a chief. Missing persons cases were rare and usually resolved within a day or 2. Someone visiting family and forgetting to mention it, someone in the hospital. But this felt different. Chief Raymond Kovar took the report himself. He'd known Walter and Edith for years. Good people, steady people. "When did you last see them?" he asked Patricia. "July 21st, she said. "Saturday. I stopped by to help with the laundry. They seemed fine. Edith was tired, but that's normal." "And no one's heard from them since?" "No one." Kovar made some calls. The hospital in nearby Crete, no admissions under their names. The clinic in Wilber, they hadn't been in. Friends, neighbors, the church, no one had seen them. He put out a statewide bulletin for the car. A beige 1958 Chevrolet 210, license plate 225910. Then he started asking questions. The neighbors on the Krupkas' street all told the same story. They'd seen the couple come home that evening, around 8:30, maybe a little earlier. They'd seen them leave again, 10 minutes later, maybe less. North, then east. That was it. Kovar interviewed 7 neighbors over 2 days. Mrs. Beniz across the street, the Svoboda family next door, old Mr. Petrick, who lived 3 houses down and sat on his porch every evening. All of them had seen the Chevrolet pull in. All of them had seen it pull out. None of them thought it was unusual. "They took drives all the time," Mrs. Bean said. "Just around town, out to the farm. Nothing unusual." "Did they seem upset? Arguing?" Kovar asked. "No. Walter helped Edith out of the car, just like always. Slow, careful. She was leaning on him pretty heavy." "And when they left?" "Same thing. He helped her in. She couldn't get in by herself anymore, you know. Then he backed out and drove off." Mr. Petrick remembered something else. "The trunk," he said. "When Walter helped Edith into the car that evening, I noticed the trunk was sitting lower, like it was weighted down, but I didn't think nothing of it at the time." "But where had they gone?" Kovar checked with Dennis. Did his parents own property anywhere else? Anywhere they might have gone? "My dad has a farm near Western," Dennis said. "About 15 miles west. I manage it for him. But I drove out there on August 2nd, just to check on some equipment. The place was empty. No sign of them." "Would they have gone to Kansas? Family down there?" "Maybe. But my dad told me just a couple weeks ago he wasn't planning to travel anymore. He said they were staying close to home." Kovar made a note of that. Staying close to home. So why buy a Kansas-Nebraska road map? On August 6th, Kovar interviewed Gene Matson at the service station. "Yeah, Walt bought a map," Gene said. "July 14th, I think. Kansas, Nebraska. I remember because he asked for that one specifically." "Did he say why?" "Nope. I asked if he was planning a trip." He just nodded and left. Kovar wrote it down. Then he asked Dennis about it. "A map?" Dennis frowned. "He didn't mention it to me. That doesn't make sense. He told me they weren't going anywhere." This detail feels minor, but it isn't. Because if Walter was planning to stay home, why buy a map? And if he was planning to leave, why lie about it? Leonard Beniz came forward on August 8th. He told Kovar about seeing Walter load the suitcases and the box into the trunk on the afternoon of July 28th. "I asked him if he was going somewhere," Leonard said. "He told me he was cleaning out the garage." Kovar drove out to the Krupka house with Dennis. They checked the garage. Everything was in its place. Tools on pegboards, old paint cans on shelves, a workbench covered in sawdust. Nothing looked disturbed. Nothing looked like it had been recently moved or cleared out. Dennis stood in the middle of the garage, looking around. "I don't understand," he said quietly. "Why would he lie?" The theory formed quickly. Too quickly, maybe. Walter was depressed. Edith was dying, not immediately, but her health was failing, and everyone could see it. Walter had said repeatedly to multiple people that he would never put her in a nursing home. "I'll take care of her myself," he'd told Father Tomasz Novak, the priest at St. Wenceslaus. Until the end. What if he'd meant that literally? What if he'd decided he couldn't take care of her anymore? What if he couldn't bear to watch her suffer? What if he'd driven them both into one of the water-filled sandpits that dotted the countryside around Wilber? It was a grim theory, but it fit. The suitcases? Maybe he'd packed their clothes, their belongings, as a kind of ritual, a way to make it feel less like despair and more like a departure. The map? Maybe he'd been searching for a place to do it, somewhere far from home, somewhere they wouldn't be found right away. Chief Kovar didn't like the theory, but he couldn't ignore it. There were dozens of sandpits in the area, old gravel quarries, abandoned in the 1950s and 60s, that had filled with groundwater over the years. deep, murky, hidden by trees and tall grass. Some were well known. Teenagers went swimming there in summer, despite the no trespassing signs. Others were forgotten, grown over, accessible only by tractor paths through cornfields. Kovar organized search teams, volunteers, deputies from neighboring counties, divers when they could get them. They started in mid-August. The first pit they checked was off County Road 19, about 3 miles north of Wilber. A local dive team brought in sonar equipment, scanned the bottom. Nothing but old tires, a rusted bed frame, beer cans. The second pit, near Western, took 2 days to search. Deeper water, worse visibility. The divers found a tractor that had fallen in sometime in the 1950s, the skeleton of a deer, and nothing else. They checked the pits closest to Wilber first, then the ones near Western, where Walter's farm was located. Then they widened the radius. Pit after pit, week after week, nothing. They widened the search. Pits along Highway 103, pits near the Saline County line, even some pits just over the border in Kansas, in case Walter had driven south. By late September, they'd checked 19 pits. Still nothing. Weeks passed, then a month, then 2. No car, no bodies, no sign that the Krupkas had ever been in any of those pits. The searches stopped in late October, but in early September, something else had happened. A highway patrol officer in Garden City, Kansas, about 150 miles south of Wilber, reported seeing a vehicle matching the Krupkas' description at a rest stop on Highway 83. Beige Chevrolet sedan, older model, an elderly couple inside. By the time backup arrived, the car was gone. The officer couldn't confirm the license plate. He'd only caught a glimpse as the vehicle pulled away, but he was certain about the make and color. Chief Kovar noted it in the file. Without confirmation, there was nothing to pursue. And by October, the theory of suicide had already taken hold in Wilber. The sighting was filed away, forgotten. By the fall of 1973, the case was cold. There were no leads, no witnesses beyond the neighbors who'd seen them leave, no evidence of foul play. The house sat empty. Dennis couldn't bring himself to clear it out. Not yet. He and Patricia drove by sometimes just to check on it, make sure no one had broken in, make sure everything was still in order. One evening in late October, they sat in the car in the driveway, engine off, looking at the dark windows. "Do you think he did it?" Patricia asked quietly. "The sand pit thing?" Dennis was silent for a long time. "I don't know," he said finally. "Part of me thinks yes. He was so tired, Pat. He was exhausted, and he kept saying he wouldn't put her in a home. But he lied about the suitcases. He lied about the map. Why lie if you're planning to kill yourself? Who are you hiding from?" Patricia didn't have an answer. They sat there until it got dark, then drove home. The theory persisted, though. Suicide. A quiet, desperate act by a man who couldn't see another way forward. People in Wilber believed it, or wanted to believe it, because the alternative, that something else had happened, something they couldn't explain, was worse. But here's what doesn't quite add up. If Walter was planning to kill himself and Edith, why pack suitcases? Why take Edith's purse? Why buy a road map 2 weeks in advance? Suicide is usually impulsive, or if it's planned quietly, secretly. You don't load luggage into your car in broad daylight where your neighbor can see you. You don't stop at a gas station and ask for a specific map. You don't tell your son you're staying home, then prepare for a trip. It was a convenient theory, clean, tragic, but understandable. The kind of story that lets a town move on. But convenient theories aren't always correct ones. In 1980, 7 years after they disappeared, Walter and Edith Krupka, were declared legally dead. The farm near Western was sold. The house in Wilber eventually went to Dennis, who rented it out, then sold it years later. The case file gathered dust in the basement of the Saline County Sheriff's Office, and for more than 3 decades, that was where the story ended. No answers, no closure, just 2 people who drove north, then east, into the warm Nebraska night, and never came back. But in 2009, something changed. A local historian, Marcus Barta, was working on a book about Czech immigration to Nebraska. He'd been researching for 3 years, traveling to libraries, interviewing families, digging through old records. In May 2009, he was granted access to the archives of St. Wenceslaus Catholic Church. The church had closed in 2007, its congregation folding into a larger parish in the next town over. The archives were stored in the basement of the old rectory. Boxes and boxes of records, dusty and disorganized, baptismal certificates, marriage licenses, donation logs, correspondence dating back to the 1920s. The basement smelled like old paper and mildew. A single bulb hung from the ceiling. Marcus worked alone, sorting through decades of parish life. Weddings, funerals, first communions, the rhythms of a small-town church, recorded in careful handwriting, filed away and forgotten. Marcus spent 2 weeks sorting through it all. On the morning of May 18th, he found an unmarked manila envelope tucked between 2 ledgers from 1973. It was yellowed, brittle at the edges, no address, no stamp. He opened it carefully. Inside was a letter, handwritten, 3 pages, dated August 15th, 1973. Inside was a letter, handwritten, 3 pages, dated August 15th, 1973. It was from Father Tomasz Novak, the priest who'd served at St. Wenceslaus in the early 1970s. It was addressed to the Bishop of Lincoln. It had never been sent. Marcus read the first page, then the second, then the third. Then he drove straight to the Saline County Sheriff's Office. Part 2. Detective Caroline Reed was 41 years old in 2009, a 15-year veteran of the Saline County Sheriff's Office. She'd worked robberies, assaults, domestic cases. She'd never worked a cold case before. But when Marcus Barta walked into the office on the afternoon of May 18th with a yellowed envelope in his hands, everything changed. "You need to read this," he said. Reed took the letter to her desk, sat down, started reading. The handwriting was careful, almost formal. The ink had faded in places, but the words were clear. "Your Excellency, I write to you in confidence regarding a matter that has weighed heavily on my conscience since late July. I have prayed for guidance, but I remain uncertain of my path forward, and so I seek your counsel. On July 22, 1973, Mrs. Edith Krupka came to me for confession. She is a faithful parishioner, a woman I have known for many years. What she told me that day was not a sin, but a fear. She said her husband, Walter, was planning something. She did not know what, but she believed it involved leaving Wilber. He had been secretive, she said, evasive. He had told their son they would not be traveling, but she did not believe him. She asked me if it was a sin to leave without saying goodbye. I did not understand the question at the time. I told her that family matters were between her and her husband, and that God would guide them. But now, Excellency, I fear I misunderstood. On the evening of July 27th, I returned to the church after supper to prepare for the following day's Mass. It was nearly 9 p.m., and the church was dark. But when I entered, I saw a figure kneeling in the front pew. It was Walter Krupka. I approached quietly, not wishing to disturb him, but he heard me and turned. His face was wet. He'd been crying. I asked if everything was all right. He looked at me for a long moment. Then he said, "I'm doing what I have to do, Father. For Edith. She deserves better than this." I asked what he meant. What did Edith deserve? "Peace," he said. "Dignity. To be cared for without being looked at like she's already gone." He stood, slowly, like his joints ached. "I made her a promise 52 years ago," he said. "For better or worse, in sickness and health. I'm keeping that promise." He crossed himself. Then he left. I called after him, but he didn't turn back. The next day, July 28th, the Krupkas disappeared. "Excellency, I do not know if I should go to the police with this information. The seal of confession is sacred, but Mrs. Krupka did not confess a sin. She confessed a fear, and Walter's words to me were not given in confession. I have heard the rumors in town that Walter took his own life, and Edith's with him, that they are at the bottom of some forgotten sandpit, beyond reach, beyond help. But I do not believe that is what happened. I believe Walter left. I believe he took Edith with him, and I believe he did not want to be found. I ask for your guidance in this matter. Yours in Christ, Father Tomasz Novak." Reed read the letter twice. What's strange is that Father Novak never sent it. He wrote it, dated it, sealed it in an envelope, but he never mailed it. Why? Maybe he was afraid of breaking the seal of confession, even indirectly. Maybe he thought the police wouldn't listen, or maybe he realized that sending the letter wouldn't bring the Krupkas back. Whatever the reason, the letter had stayed in that envelope for 36 years. Then she opened the case file. It was thin. Witness statements, search logs, a few photographs of the house, the empty driveway, the stacks of newspapers on the porch, and a note written by Chief Kovar in November 1973. Case suspended. No evidence of foul play. Presumed suicide. Reed leaned back in her chair. "Presumed," she said aloud. "Not confirmed. Presumed." The next morning, Reed drove to Lincoln to meet with the diocese archives. Father Novak had died in 1998, but the church kept records of all its clergy. She learned that Novak had served at St. Wenceslaus from 1970 to 1979, then transferred to a parish in Grand Island. He'd been well liked, known for his discretion and his kindness. The archivist showed her Novak's personnel file. Inside was a note written by the Bishop of Lincoln in 1980, acknowledging Novak's concerns about the Krupka case, but stating that without concrete evidence, the church could not interfere in a police matter. The letter Novak had written in 1973 had been filed away, never sent, never acted upon. Reed asked if there were any other records related to the Krupkas. The archivist checked. There was one more document, a note in the church ledger for July 28, 1973. It read, "W. Krupka, confession, 4 p.m. Walter had gone to confession on the day he disappeared. Father Novak had heard that confession, and whatever Walter had said, Novak had taken it to his grave." Reed returned to Wilber and started pulling records, property records first. The Krupka farm near Western had been in Walter's name since 1952. 12 acres, mostly pasture, a small barn, no house. In the summer of 1973, Walter had sold the farm. Reed found the deed in the county clerk's office, dated July 10, 1973. Buyer, Robert Hale. Purchase price, $8,500. Cash. The deed had been notarized in the neighboring county, not through Walter's usual attorney in Wilber. In 1973, rural cash transactions didn't require the same scrutiny they do today. A handshake, a signature, and cash money were often enough. Reed ran the name through every database she had. No Robert Hale with an address in Nebraska. No Robert Hale with a connection to Saline County. No Robert Hale at all, as far as she could tell. The name was fake. What's strange is this. Walter used the same fake name twice. Once for the farm sale, once at the motel. That's not random. That's planning. Reed called Dennis Krupka. He was 76 now, living in Omaha. His wife, Patricia, had died in 2004. Mr. Krupka, did you know your father sold the farm in 1973? Silence on the other end. He what? He sold it, July 10th, for $8,500. Cash. That's not possible. I managed that farm. He would have told me. Did he ever mention anyone named Robert Hale? No. Who is that? I don't know yet, Reed said, but I'm going to find out. She started with the banks. Most of the small-town banks from the 1970s had been absorbed by larger institutions, but their records still existed. Reed requested the records for Walter and Edith Krupka from the First National Bank of Wilber. 3 weeks later, the records confirmed what she'd suspected. July 15th, 1973. Walter withdrew $2,200 in cash. July 23, 1973. Edith withdrew $780 from her personal account. And then, on July 30th, 1973, 2 days after they disappeared, a check written by Walter Krupka for $150 was cashed. Not in Wilber. In Concordia, Kansas. Reed pulled up a map. Concordia was 120 miles south of Wilber, a small town, population around 6,000. She called the bank in Concordia, asked if they still had records from 1973. They didn't, but they suggested she try the local historical society. The Concordia Historical Society occupied a small building on Main Street. Reed drove down on a Tuesday morning in late June. The director, an elderly woman named Eileen Marsh, listened to Reed's questions and nodded thoughtfully. "We don't have bank records," she said, "but we do have something else." She led Reed to a back room filled with filing cabinets. "Local businesses used to donate their old records to us," Eileen said. "Motels, restaurants, gas stations. Nobody thought they'd be useful, but you never know." She opened a cabinet labeled Sunset Motor Lodge, 1960 to 1980. Inside were guest registration books, dozens of them. Eileen pulled out the one labeled 1973. "Let's see," she said, flipping through the pages. July, here." She turned the book toward Reed. July 29th, 1973. Guest name, Mr. and Mrs. Robert Hale. Address, Nebraska. Room 12. Paid cash. Checked out July 30th. Reed stared at the entry. "Do you have any idea who actually signed this?" she asked. Eileen shook her head. "The motel closed in 1995. The owner died a few years later. But," she hesitated, "there's a woman who used to work there, Dorothy Clarkson. She was the front desk manager for years. She's in her 80s now, lives over on Elm Street. You could try talking to her." Dorothy Clarkson lived in a small house with a tidy front lawn and a porch swing. She answered the door slowly, leaning on a cane. Reed introduced herself, explained the case. Dorothy's eyes lit up. "I remember them," she said. "You do?" "Oh, yes. It's not every day you get a couple like that. Come in, dear. I'll make us some tea." They sat in Dorothy's living room. Family photos on the walls, a cat sleeping on the armchair. Dorothy moved slowly, but her mind was sharp. She invited Reed inside, made tea, sat down in an armchair by the window. "It was late July," Dorothy said, 1973. "I remember because it was so hot that summer. We had this couple check in late in the evening, maybe 8 o'clock or 9 o'clock p.m. Can you describe them?" "Older. 70s, I'd say. The man was tall, thin, gray hair, looked tired. The woman was shorter, Moved real slow. She looked sick, pale. She had trouble walking. The man had to help her from the car to the office, then from the office to their room. Do you remember what they said? Dorothy nodded. The man did all the talking. He asked for a room for one night. Paid cash. $35, I think. He was nervous, kept looking out the window like he was expecting someone. Did he say where they were coming from? Nebraska. That's all he wrote in the guest book. Just Nebraska. Did he say where they were going? I asked if they were passing through. He said yes. I asked where they were headed. He looked at me for a second like he wasn't sure if he should answer. Then he said, south, toward Oklahoma. Oklahoma? That's what he said. I remember thinking it was a strange answer. Most people would say a city, you know? Tulsa, Oklahoma City. But he just said south. Think about that answer. Not Oklahoma City. Not visiting family. Just south. Like a direction, not a destination. Did you see them leave? The next morning, early, maybe 7 a.m. I was at the desk when they checked out. The woman looked worse than she had the night before, like she hadn't slept. The man helped her to the car, a beige sedan. Old, I don't remember the make. Reed pulled out a photo from the case file, a picture of Walter and Edith, taken at a church picnic in 1972. She handed it to Dorothy. Is this them? Dorothy studied the photo, nodded slowly. That's them, she said. I'm sure of it. Reed returned to her office and started pulling records from Oklahoma. She checked death certificates, hospital admissions, anything that might show a Walter or Edith Krupka or anyone using the name Robert Hale. Nothing. She expanded the search. Colorado, New Mexico, Texas, Arizona. Days turned into weeks. Reed worked the case in between her regular duties. A robbery at a convenience store, a domestic dispute, a missing teenager who turned up at a friend's house 2 days later. But the Krupka case stayed in her mind. She pulled maps, traced possible routes from Concordia, Kansas, heading south, highways, back roads, small towns where an elderly couple could disappear. Still nothing. Then she tried something else. Social Security records. In 2009, accessing old Social Security data required a court order, but Reed got one. She submitted a request for any activity on Walter and Edith Krupka's Social Security numbers after July 1973. The results came back in August. Walter's number, no activity after July 1973. Edith's number, one hit, November 1973. The number had been used for hospital admission records at Mercy Medical Center in Durango, Colorado. Durango was a small city in the southwestern corner of Colorado, nestled in the San Juan Mountains. Population around 10,000 in the 1970s. Reed called the hospital, asked if they had records from 1973. They did, archived but intact. She requested any files under the name Edith Krupka or any patient admitted in November 1973 using the Social Security number she provided. A week later, the records arrived. Patient name, Maria Novotny. Admitted, November 8, 1973. Diagnosis, diabetic ketoacidosis, severe dehydration. Length of stay, 14 days. Discharged, November 22, 1973. Address on file, Lot 47, Silver Creek Trailer Park, Durango, Colorado. Social Security number, Edith Krupka's number. Reed sat at her desk, staring at the file. Maria Novotny, a Czech surname. Edith wasn't Czech by birth, but she'd lived in a Czech community for 16 years. She would have known the name. Maybe she'd taken it from someone she knew. Or maybe Walter had chosen it. Reed called the Durango Police Department, asked if Silver Creek Trailer Park still existed. It didn't. The land had been sold in the 1980s, turned into a shopping center. She asked if there were any records of who had lived there in the 1970s. There weren't. Reed tried one more thing. She contacted the Colorado Department of Revenue, requested any records of a vehicle registered to Walter Krupka, Robert Hale, or Maria Novotny between 1973 and 1980. Nothing. She tried death certificates again, expanded the search to all of Colorado. Nothing. She tried property records, tax records, voter registration. Nothing. Walter and Edith Krupka had vanished into the American Southwest, and after November 1973, they'd left no trace. Reed compiled her findings into a report. She sent copies to Dennis Krupka, to the Saline County Sheriff, to the Nebraska State Patrol. The conclusion was clear. Walter and Edith Krupka had not committed suicide. They had left. Intentionally. Quietly. With a plan. Walter had sold his farm under a fake name, withdrawn cash, bought a map, packed suitcases, and driven south. They'd stopped in Concordia, Kansas, for the night. Then they'd continued south, possibly to Oklahoma, possibly beyond. By November, they were in Durango, Colorado, living under assumed names. And then, nothing. On September 12th, 2009, Reed held a press conference in Wilber. She stood in front of the old sheriff's office and read from her report. Walter and Edith Krupka did not die in 1973, she said. They left. We have evidence that they traveled to Kansas and later to Colorado, where Edith received medical treatment under a false name. We do not know where they went after that or when they died, but we know they made a choice. To leave. Together. Reporters asked questions. Did she think they were still alive? No, Reed said. I believe they both passed away sometime in the mid-1970s, but I can't prove it. Why did they leave? I believe Walter felt he couldn't provide the care Edith needed, and I believe he didn't want to place her in a facility, so he chose a third option. To take her somewhere they could be alone, somewhere no one knew them, somewhere he could care for her until the end. Was there any evidence of foul play? None, Reed said. Dennis Krupka watched the press conference on the news that night. He sat in his living room in Omaha, alone, and listened to Detective Reed describe his father's plan. When it was over, he turned off the TV. He thought about the last conversation he'd had with his father. July 1973. His father had told him they weren't traveling anymore. His father had lied. But Dennis understood why. If Walter had told the truth, Dennis would have tried to stop him. He would have argued, pleaded, maybe even called the police. So Walter had lied. To protect his plan. To protect Edith. Dennis couldn't decide if he was angry or heartbroken, maybe both. In 2011, the legal declaration of death for Walter and Edith Krupka was updated. They were still considered deceased, but the date and location of death were listed as unknown. The case was officially closed. But the story didn't end there. In May 2012, a volunteer at the Durango Public Library was digitizing old local newspapers when she came across something unusual. An obituary from January 1975. It read, Novotny, Maria, age 71, passed peacefully at home, survived by her husband Walter, private service, no flowers. The volunteer thought it was odd. Most obituaries listed more information: family members, a hometown, a cause of death. This one didn't. She kept searching. 2 months later, she found another obituary. March 1975. Novotny, Walter, age 74, passed peacefully, reunited with his beloved wife, private service. The volunteer printed both obituaries and brought them to the library director. "Do you think these are real?" she asked. The director didn't know, but she called the Durango Police Department anyway. Detective Caroline Reed received the call in June 2012. She flew to Durango the next week. She met with the library volunteer, reviewed the obituaries, and started searching records. Death certificates filed in La Plata County, Colorado in 1975. Maria Novotny. Died January 18, 1975. Cause, diabetic complications. Age, 71. Walter Novotny. Died March 9, 1975. Cause, heart failure. Age, 74. Both listed the same address, a small house on the outskirts of Durango, near the base of the mountains. Both listed the same informant on Maria's certificate. Walter Novotny, husband. On Walter's certificate, the informant was listed as County Medical Examiner. The ages were approximate, likely estimated based on appearance. In 1975, especially for individuals without family or proper identification, county officials often made their best guess. The cause of death for both was listed as natural. No autopsy had been performed. In those days, for elderly individuals without signs of foul play, that was standard procedure. Reed drove to the address listed on the death certificates. The house was still there. Small, one story, white paint peeling, overgrown yard, a chain-link fence sagging in places. It was abandoned, windows boarded up, front door padlocked. Reed stood in the driveway for a moment, looking at it, trying to imagine Walter and Edith here, in this small house, far from home, far from everything they'd known. She knocked on the door of the house next door. An elderly man answered, late 70s, maybe 80, wearing suspenders and a flannel shirt. "Help you?" he asked. "I'm Detective Caroline Reed, Saline County Sheriff's Office, Nebraska. I'm looking for information about the people who used to live there," Reed said, pointing to the White House. "In the 1970s, the man squinted at the house, then back at Reed. "Nebraska? That's a long way." "Yes, sir. This is about a cold case." He nodded slowly. "Old couple, you mean?" "Yes. Come on in. I'll tell you what I remember." His name was Frank Martinez. He'd lived in that house since 1968, raised 3 kids there, buried his wife 2 years ago. He made coffee. They sat at his kitchen table. "Yeah, I remember them," Frank said. "Moved in around late 73, I think. Maybe November. It was getting cold already. They kept to themselves. Real quiet. The woman was real sick. You could tell just by looking at her." "Do you remember their names?" Frank shook his head. "Something foreign-sounding. I asked once, but I forget. They didn't talk much. The man would nod hello if I was outside. That was about it. Did they have visitors? Family?" "Never saw anyone, just the 2 of them in that house. The man took care of her." "I'd see him helping her to the car for doctor appointments, I guess. She could barely walk." "Do you remember when they left?" "They didn't leave. The woman died first. Winter of 75, I think. I saw the ambulance. Then the man. He died a couple months later. Just him and her in that house. No family, no visitors. The county took care of the burials." "Do you know where they're buried?" The man shook his head. "Probably the county cemetery, paupers section." Reed drove to Greenlawn Cemetery on the north edge of Durango. She found the groundskeeper, an older man named Tom Riggs. "I'm looking for graves from 1975, she said. 2 people, Maria and Walter Novotny." Tom checked his records. "Yeah," he said. "Section D, unmarked." He led her to a quiet corner of the cemetery under a stand of cottonwood trees. 2 small metal markers, flat in the ground. No names, just numbers. D47, D48. "These were county burials," Tom said. No money for headstones, no family to pay for them. Reed stood there for a long time. She stood there until the sun began to set over the mountains. She thought about all the missing persons cases she'd worked, all the families who never got answers, all the bodies that were never found. The Krupkas had been found, but not the way anyone expected, not as victims, as people who'd chosen their own ending. She thought about Walter and Edith Krupka, two people who'd spent 52 years together, who'd lost children, who'd buried grief and kept going, who'd made a choice, in the end, to leave everything behind, to live out their final years together in a place where no one knew them, where no one could judge them, where Walter could care for Edith the way he'd promised. And when she died, he'd stayed just long enough to make sure she was buried properly. Then he'd followed her. No fanfare, no family, no explanation, just two graves under the cottonwoods, marked with numbers instead of names. Reed returned to Nebraska in July 2012. She met with Dennis Krupka one last time. She told him what she'd found, the obituaries, the death certificates, the graves. Dennis sat quietly, listening. When she finished, he nodded. "Can I see them?" he asked. "The graves?" "Of course," Reed said. In August 2012, Dennis Krupka flew to Durango, Colorado. He rented a car at the airport, drove to Green Lawn Cemetery. It was a warm afternoon. The cottonwoods were full and green. He found the graves easily. Detective Reed had sent him directions, Section D, graves 47 and 48. He stood there for a long time. Two metal markers in the ground, numbers, no names. He thought about his father, a man who'd crossed an ocean at 17 with nothing, who'd worked his whole life with his hands, who'd buried two children and kept going, who'd loved his wife so much that he'd given up everything, his home, his son, his identity, rather than let strangers take care of her. Dennis knelt down, touched the markers. "I understand, Dad," he said quietly. "I'm not angry anymore. I understand." He stood there until the sun began to set behind the mountains. Then he visited the White House where they'd lived. It was still abandoned, still decaying. He couldn't go inside, but he stood in the yard and looked at the windows and tried to imagine them there. Walter making breakfast, Edith sitting in a chair by the window, the two of them alone, together, until the end. He cried. Not because his father had lied to him, not because they'd left without saying goodbye, but because he finally understood. His father had kept his promise. He'd taken care of Edith, until the end. And when she was gone, he'd followed her. Not out of despair, not out of weakness, out of love. Dennis understood that now. His father hadn't abandoned him. He'd chosen to honor his wife in the only way he knew how, to give her peace, to give her dignity. To be with her, alone, away from the pity and the questions and the slow decline that would have come if they'd stayed. It wasn't the choice Dennis would have made, but it was his father's choice, and in the end, maybe that was enough. A year later, Dennis paid for 2 headstones, simple granite markers. One read, "Edith Krupka, 1903 to 1975, beloved wife and mother." The other, "Walter Krupka, 1901 to 1975, devoted husband. Rest together." The markers were installed in September 2013, 40 years after Walter and Edith had disappeared into the Nebraska night, 38 years after they'd died, alone, in a small house in Colorado. The case is closed now. No mystery remains. Walter and Edith Krupka left because they chose to, because staying meant watching Edith suffer in a place where everyone would see, where everyone would pity them, where the system would eventually take her from him. So they left. They sold the farm, withdrew their savings, packed what they could carry, and drove south. They stopped in Kansas, then Oklahoma, then Colorado. They found a small house. They lived quietly. And when Edith's time came, Walter was there, holding her hand. 2 months later, his heart gave out. Or maybe it just stopped wanting to beat without her. There are no clear answers in cases like this, no villains, no heroes, just two people who made a choice that no one else understood. The story doesn't end with closure. It ends with 2 headstones in a quiet cemetery under trees that weren't there when they were buried, and with the knowledge that some disappearances aren't about running away. They're about holding on to each other until the very end.